So here's a quick tutorial on creating the roll bone automation, and that is going to be for the left forearm roll. For the little troll here that we're working with, we have the manipulator, which is the left hand manipulator. Okay. On this one we have to create a connection between the joint, which is our roll bone, that's going to be this guy right here, the left forearm roll, and we have the left hand manipulator. So between these two we're going to come up with a connection to where this guy rotates in the x-axis will be cut down in half, and that information will be sent out to this. And that's going to be how we get a little more realistic rotation for the geometry that this one is going to be manipulating. Okay. So first off, one of the things you could do is you could hide the IK handle. It's really not going to get in our way in this case, so I'm going to leave mine up here. But I do want to bring up my hypershade. So going up to Window, down to Rendering Editors, over to the hypershade is how we're going to find the utility node. So when we click on hypershade, that's going to bring open our hypershade, and one of the easiest ways to get there is to go to the section here that has the different types of nodes, and you're going to see that right now with nothing selected in here, everything is loaded, and it could be kind of painful to find this stuff other than typing on the top. But we can actually single out our nodes here by going to the categories here and click on the utilities category, and that's going to bring up this stuff here. We can scroll down, and what we're looking for is a multiply divide node. Okay, so these ones are pretty nice because if I click on this, you're going to see that it has a multiply divide option here, and you're going to see that the settings, we can tell it to multiply or divide some of our other settings that we would like to automate and have cut down in half. The way that you want to think of this node is you want to think of this node as a mediary node. So something has to go through it and it interprets something for something coming in. It will interpret it, do the math calculation for us, and send it out to another object. And in this case, it's going to have an input coming from our, let me slide this over here, our left hand manipulator, okay, and it will have an output going to the left forearm roll. So if I take this multiply divide node and I double click it, I can bring it open in the attribute editor, and the attribute editor will basically have three different axes. And anytime we're looking in Maya, this is always going to be set up to where the first box or input box is X, Y, and Z. So first input box is X, second being Y, and the third being Z. The inputs are the values that we're going to change. So in this case, what we're going to end up doing is whatever input we choose to use, and we can use multiple ones, we can take that and change the value down here to have it work. And we'll come back to this just so that you get familiar with this. Okay, first off is this. We want to have the multiply divide node selected, and I'll actually just bring it over to the side like this, and I'll make this a little bit smaller so that it's easier to see. And I'll drag this way, and we're going to be working with this first being our manipulator, so our left hand manipulator, and I'm going to load up the connection editor because I want to connect that, an output from here going into an input from here, and then we'll take the output of this guy and send it out to the forearm roll. So the first thing that I will do is just select this, and you don't necessarily have to have anything selected to bring up the connection editor. And on the flip side, because what we can do is if we don't have anything selected, we can load everything. And actually, why don't I just show you that? Go up to Window, down to the General Editors, and go over to Connection Editor. And that brings up nothing. We can select anything that we want, and the outputs are going to be coming from the left column onto whatever we load into the right column, which will be accepting those as inputs. Okay, so if I were to select this being our manipulator or controller, I can reload the left hand side, and I always want to look at the bottom here where it says left hand manipulator, or manipulator, whatever the name is, will be here at the bottom, because you'll see it at the top here, but if I scroll I lose that. Okay, The next thing I could do is select the multiply divide node in this case, go back to the connection editor and reload right, okay? Because I want something coming out from here and coming into here, and in this case it's going to be rotations. Another thing that I could do is that if I didn't have the connection editor up, I could select the order of what I want to be on the left hand side by selecting that object first. In this case it would be the controller. Then I could shift select or control select the multiply divide node. In this case I have to shift select. So in here I selected the first object being the controller that will be loaded on the left hand side. The multiply divide node will be loaded on the right hand side since it was selected secondly. So I'll go up to Window, down to General Editors, and I'll come over here to the Connection Editor, and you're going to see that I have the same selection that I would have had if I would load these individually. Okay, and it was because I had loaded or selected the left hand manipulator first, and then I shift selected this multiply divide node that it did end up in this order. Okay, so on the left hand side I do want to make sure that left hand manip is right here, and I'm looking for rotate, just the general rotates. Okay, and you're going to see that they're showing as connected, and anytime you see something italicized like that, it's showing as connected to something, but that's okay, we could have it connected to multiple things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down the X, Y, and Z axes by clicking that plus sign there, because I'm going to connect the rotate X axes to the multiply divide node's input. Okay, the input 1 is what I want these things to come into, so I'm going to drop down the input 1 by clicking the little plus sign there, and what I'm going to connect is the rotate X to the input 1X. Okay, now I like to mention that with this multiply divide node we don't necessarily have to have an X value going to an X value on this side. Okay, we really want to just think of this as this thing accepting in any of its axes, I guess we could say, or any of its inputs. We can consider this node an input and output. So all this thing is really doing is we're going to be using this to cut down the rotation value by half. So we could really have rotate X go into input Y, and then we would have this when we load it here in a little bit, and you'll see that we can have the output Y of this multiply divide node go into something else like the left forearm roll, which is going to be the joint that is accepting this information. Okay, so really what you want to think of this multiply divide node as is an input and output. Okay, and it's just going to take some of the values and change them for us. So it doesn't matter what input and output you can use any of them. In this case, it makes a little more sense when you're first doing this to connect the rotate X to the input X. Okay, and you're going to have to do this for the right hand side, so what you're going to have to decide is for the right hand if you're going to use the rotate X of the right controller or right hand manipulator, and if you want it to go into like the input Y or the input Z of this same multiply divide node, or if you're going to want to connect it to a different multiply divide node. So in here I have this connected, okay, and what I'll do is now, since these are connected, you see that they're italicized and they're both highlighted in blue. That indicates they're connected. I will select just the multiply divide node by clicking on it once with my left mouse button. I'll come over here to the connection editor and reload left, and you're going to see that now if I compare it to itself, because multiply divide node is on both columns now, it has only inputs on this side. It only is accepting stuff on the right hand side. But now, as it's loaded in the left hand side, it has outputs. And I'll drop the outputs down by clicking the little plus sign here, showing my different axes to output. Okay. Now, I want to load something that's going to be accepting that information on the right hand side. And that, in this case, is going to be our left forearm roll. So I will select that joint, that little left forearm roll bone, and I'll come over here to reload right. You're going to see left forearm roll is in this section, and it's going to be taking that information as a connection. So I'm going to look for the rotate value and click on the plus sign, and what I'm going to be sending out from the multiply divide node is the output X, because that's what I had something incoming to. If I had something incoming to output Y, which is something I definitely could have done, then I would send that out, okay, to the rotate X value here. So in this case, I have it coming into input X, and it needs to go out from the X value, the output X, to the rotate X of this joint. Okay, so I have this connection now to where, and I'll just close this, to where I have this object. Okay, its rotations are not only affecting the wrist in the z-axis and the y-axis, like this, but also the x-axis, okay, like that. And if I want it to rotate and I want it to rotate the wrist in the x value, but I also want that x value to rotate the x value of this joint, then I would connect it just like we did. And one thing to do is to check this. And to check this, I would rotate this, but right now I haven't changed any information in the multiply divide node, so I need to do that. Because right now if I were to rotate this, and let me bring up the channel box, if I were to rotate the controller's X value by 90, for instance, and I hit enter, I have a 90-degree rotation. If I select that joint's X value has a 90-degree rotation. Okay, so what I have to do is I have to get that multiply divide node to cut it down by half. So let me put this back to 0, the controller, and I'm going to bring up my multiply divide node. So I'll go to Window, down to Rendering Editors, and go over to the Hypershade one more time. And the multiply divide node is still in here in the work area. But let's say that you closed your scene and you reopen it and you're working on a bunch of different things, and then you're going to set this thing up because you made the nodes because you know you're going to use them, but you decide you're going to come back to this because you have to go to work or whatever. It's not really going to show up in here because this is a Materials tab. What you're going to want to do is go over to this tab which says Utilities, because it's a utility node. You would click it and you'd be able to find it right here. Okay, and it's always a good idea to name this stuff, so feel free to name this, but in this case we're working with it just from here, and I can go back and name it. But if I needed to find it, I could find it here, and I would want to open it up in the attribute editor here. So I could either double click it here like that, or select it and hit Control A. Okay, so you'll see that Control A is going to show or hide the attribute editor. So now I can close the Hypershade here, and I have the multiply divide node right here, and the input is indicated right here as being connected to something just because it has this yellow color coming into the input. If I go to the input 2, this is the value that's going to be the multiply or divide section of this input. So if I say that I want to multiply it or cut it down by half, I can put 0.5 in here instead of 1. And I'm really saying to cut that down by half. So mathematically that works as well. So cutting it down by half is 0.5 here, or 50% if you will. And then it's going to send that via the output. So whatever's coming in, it cuts down by half and sends it out to the joint. So again, it comes in from the connection is this guy right here, our manipulator. And then it goes into the multiply divide node. The multiply divide node cuts down that value by half and sends out that value to the joint. So to check this, what I can do is I can select the manipulator or controller, if you will, and come to the channel box, and if I go to rotate X and type in 90, because that's the connection that we made, I will deselect this and then I will click on the joint. You're going to see that it's connected correctly because the joint only rotated 45 degrees. So the rotation of the joint is 45 degrees when the rotation of the manipulator is 90. So the connection is working perfectly. Okay? So I'll put this back to 0. And another thing that you could have done is connected it to the Y or Z input and output instead. Okay? So if you guys have any questions on that, feel free to email me and let me know, and I will reply to that and help you guys out with connecting that to the right arm if you choose to use that same utility node. Otherwise, what you could do is you can make another utility node and use the X inputs and outputs from the manipulator that you're going to have for the right arm, and its rotation going out to the right forearm roll. Okay, so hopefully this is helpful. Feel free to email me if you have any questions.